Story 1. I should preface this by stating that I grew up in a working class, former mining town far from London, and I am of an immigrant background, Estonian by ethnicity, which was not a member of the European Union when my family moved here before I was born. Firstly, one of the main points that people like to throw around when it comes to the Brexit debate is immigration, so let's start with that. Immigration, especially in terms of the quotas the European Union was trying to impose on us, simply wasn't practical for the ordinary people of the United Kingdom. Britain is a densely populated island. We are in the midst of a housing crisis, and our National Health Service is on the brink of collapse. We are struggling to cope with our population as it stands, and importing hundreds of thousands of people per year who statistically are more likely to have more children is going to cause further pressures down the line. The immigration argument is usually mobilized by Remainers to try and paint Brexit supporters as racist or a similar word, when the way that businessmen make use of the high rates of immigration is actually pretty exploitative, all things considered. Foreign workers are more likely to work for cheaper pay, which means that businessmen employed them in their thousands in order to be able to get away with underpaying workers for cheap labor. Native workers just couldn't keep up with that and lost a lot of work. This is where the whole immigrants taking our jobs thing comes from. While many Remainers like to mock this, it's actually a huge problem that affects not only the now underpaid foreign workers but working-class laborers too, who are now expected to accept lower pay for their work. At the end of it all, the main beneficiary of the immigration policy is businessmen who exploit foreign workers to increase their own profits. Another problem with the European Union is that, as a globalist organization working on a huge international scale, it is necessary for the European Union to centralize where it can to save time and prevent dithering. That's understandable. What that did mean for the United Kingdom is that London became even more of the United Kingdom's economic center than it was before and meant that a larger proportion of capital flowed towards London. This, of course, benefited London and the South East and is probably why London and the South East voted to remain. However, it meant that less investment went to smaller towns whose industries were now being forgotten for cheaper industrial prices abroad, which is again facilitated by European Union policy. Industries shut down and people lost jobs. However, because the money that Britain was gaining from the European Union was mostly going to London, as I will say once again, London mostly does benefit from the European Union, hence why they voted to stay. We didn't get funding to create new jobs here, and our schools were, and still are, disgustingly underfunded. One of the nearest schools to where I lived has only 1% of students achieving the English baccalaureate, which means you pass a certain amount of core academic subjects. It's not considered difficult usually, and the wider picture is not pretty either. Likewise, our local hospitals are constantly running out of beds to treat patients in, and again, we do not receive the funding to fix that. Meanwhile, because London got plenty of money from the European Union, they were able to maintain their high-speed railways and vanity projects. This was a bit of a kick in the teeth for working-class towns and, in my opinion, definitely caused resentment. There is a lot more to it, but ultimately something that I don't see a lot in the Brexit debate is the idea that some areas benefit more than others. Did London benefit? On the whole, yes. But whether or not the forgotten working-class towns in the North and Midlands did is an entirely different story. I'm not exactly a huge fan of socialism myself, but even I think that the European Union's use of capitalism genuinely does harm the working class here, whether or not groups who profess to be in the working class interests want to admit it. Story 2. I voted Remain, but recently, and for the first time, I'm seeing some well-reasoned arguments for leaving. I think I may have fallen victim to the echo chamber effect, where all I was seeing from the Leave side were the most extreme examples of absurdity and racism. Likewise, I expect Leave voters have only seen the worst of the Remain side. When I dig deep, I don't actually have any great admiration for the European Union. What made me want to keep them was that I perceive them as keeping the United Kingdom right in check, particularly the Conservatives. I like that they mean we have certain workers' rights, human rights, business regulations, etc. I worry that Conservatives would ditch those in a heartbeat. But what I'm actually doing is aligning with an undemocratic institution because they've done some things that I like. In exactly the same way that Leavers aligned with the Conservatives when Theresa May tried to bypass Parliament in triggering Article 50, and Boris Johnson literally broke the law to prevent Parliament from debating his deal. I still wouldn't vote Leave, but I wouldn't be so quick to vote Remain either. I think the Tories have been an absolute disgrace through this whole thing, and could have achieved a lot more by taking a measured approach to dealing with Britain's numerous issues that got blamed on the European Union. As a member, we could have addressed issues with the European Union itself. If we were going to leave, they should have had a plan, and they should have had cross-party consensus. That would have been the decent, democratic thing to do, especially given the split result. Instead, they're playing political games and using Brexit to desperately cling to power. I'm still terrified of them. Story 3. I am 29 and voted to leave the European Union for the following reasons. I work in the development of flexible and renewable power generation in the United Kingdom, which I have done for my entire working life. I have installed over 750 megawatts in the last 7 years, a combination of onshore wind, energy storage, batteries, flexible gas generation, and demand-side response technology. My small industry is incredibly important to the UK energy market, not only because it is critical to the growth of renewable clean generation, but also because we provide the peaking service, which is critical to prevent blackouts. Our market was effectively brought to its knees from 2014 to 2019, with several key leaders in the market going out of business, laying off large numbers of staff, and essentially mothballing the industry. The reason for the market downturn was because of the UK government being taken to court by an Australian energy consultancy. They claimed that the method by which contracts are awarded to build generating sites was in breach of the European Union state aid rules, despite the EU initially approving the process several years earlier. Because of the court case, there was a freeze on payments for existing contracts that had been awarded as early as 2014 and a suspension of any further contracts being awarded. It dragged on until September last year, when it was confirmed that no breach of state aid had occurred. To cut a long story short, for 3 years our market was frozen. Hundreds lost their jobs, and key developments to grow and modernize the UK energy sector for the future were halted or abandoned because of a technicality around whether the UK was breaching EU rules on state aid. The impact will not only be for the 3-year period. Investors lost interest and have moved on to other industries. There have been brain drains, with development teams being disbanded or moving to other industries, and developing a site takes years. Companies are required to have many sites in the churn because there is a low success rate. You cannot have all your eggs in one basket. If you stop all of that and let the machine grind to a halt, it takes a huge amount of time and effort to get it going again, and you will not reap any rewards for years because the return rate is low. In an industry as important as energy, it will result in a gap in new generation coming online. Maybe it will not be seen for 5 to 10 years, but there will be an imbalance between old generation going offline and new generation coming on because of this market stagnation. It will result in panic buying and short-termism by the UK government and a gold rush in the market with poor quality, high emissions generation coming online to plug the gap, as that is the quickest generation to get online. People often argue the take-back control argument and are shouted down with claims that the EU does not regulate or specify laws in the UK. However, as a developer of power generation in the UK, I can categorically state that on a daily basis, we are required to navigate EU legislation, from fairly complex legislation around emissions and environmental impacts to more mundane things such as undertaking impact assessments to determine if there are endangered species in the proposed development area. Obviously, it is important that this kind of legislation exists. However, the issue is that the EU is required to apply broad brush policies which cover the diverse nations of the EU, and it is impossible to lobby for special dispensations because the EU democratic process is so detached from everyday business. If every industry in every country were lobbying for special dispensation, the entire concept of the EU would fall apart. It is well known that the further you are from democracy, the more disenfranchised you feel, which is why there has been a drive towards devolution all over Europe. If you take the simple example of impact assessments to identify the presence of endangered species in the development area, it can sometimes be the case that the species you are searching for do not live in the UK or do live in the UK but are abundant. However, because that species might be endangered in Poland or Italy, every site developed in the EU needs to have this process undertaken. It might sound trivial, but we typically have 50 to 100 sites in the churn at any one time. Each report might cost £3,000 and take 4 weeks, which suddenly becomes a massive financial burden. In summary, I work in the development of power generation in the UK. My market was almost destroyed by EU red tape and misreading or misinterpreting of their own rules. Although it might not be the case that the EU mandates the shape of bananas, in my experience, EU law and legislation need to be navigated daily. Navigating law and legislation is always going to be required, whether in or out of the EU, but lobbying, focus groups, and consultations on legislation is far more effective at a national level. The EU is too dense and detached from the coal face, and it is literally a box-ticking exercise and a burden. To clarify my perspective, some have interpreted my comment as wanting to leave the EU to become some deregulated Wild West. However, my actual belief is that the people most capable of putting in place effective legislation in the UK are the UK government. That does not automatically result in a lowering of standards and will likely result in the improvement of standards in some areas and the lowering in others to meet the specific needs of the UK. I hope you would give me the benefit of the doubt. I have worked in renewable energy my entire life and have no interest in the rollout of big fossil fuel generators and the destruction of our environment. Additionally, it was not the Australian company's fault. They just happened to be Australian and had a vested interest in damaging the market. They did that by launching a court case which the EU failed to quickly resolve, resulting in long-term stagnation in the market, which will have long-term repercussions for the industry and the UK's move to lowering carbon emissions and increasing clean power. Story 4. Depending on what industry you work in, continued European Union mandates support European multinationals over small businesses. I voted Remain in 2016, but after being made redundant in 2019 due to new European Union legislation absolutely affecting all but the biggest players in my industry, mobile power systems, Stage 5 emissions requiring individual type approval rather than calculated outputs, rendered small bespoke solutions non-viable, among other pieces of more recent legislation, such as Article 13 and the moves to further solidify the pillars, European Union Army, etc., I find myself quite happy that it is happening. Story 5. Synopsis. There is huge inequality in the European Union. Bulgaria uses horse-drawn carts, and Poland has abysmally low wages. This continues, and British companies love this. Instead of having mechanized farms where soft fruits are picked by machinery, there is a plethora of cheap labor to do this. The impact of refusing to innovate and embrace technology is astounding. Suddenly, you don't need engineers or service centers with skilled mechanics. Education becomes devalued. The United Kingdom government, regardless of the party in power, has systematically ignored this. Discussing this under Blair and Brown would have resulted in being labeled a racist. Governments did nothing to control the abuse of cheap labor until the Brexit vote forced a decision. While Europe has many strengths, the UK has never quite fit in. The Common Agricultural Policy is designed to keep French farmers in business and economically dominate Africa by dumping products like powdered milk at below-cost prices. The policy never made sense for the UK, hence the rebate. The European Union has struggled with implementing a concerning amount of legislation. It wasn't until August 2017, after the Brexit vote, that it became illegal to hire people in countries like Poland and Bulgaria and send them to work in places like France, Germany, and the UK at far below minimum wage. This was legal due to short-term temporary relocation. Additionally, it's legal for companies to label a product with specific percentages of ingredients and then tailor it for the local market. Birdseye and other manufacturers have different fish or meat content in prepared food for markets such as Germany versus Czechia and Bulgaria. Ever wondered why Dove soap can be cheaper across the European Union? It's marketed as if made for France, Germany, and the UK but produced as if for Romania. Then there's the issue of being unable to eject a member. Luxembourg reportedly siphons off about €4,000 of taxable revenue per European Union citizen each year. A country of fewer than 500,000 people, including foreign workers, they have a huge history of blocking change, with even Jean-Claude Juncker blocking legislation. The concept of the European Union is great, but the current implementation is absolutely awful. Leaving is foolish. Staying without serious reform is also equally foolish, and the latter isn't an option as the organization has grown too big too quickly. To be completely clear, Nigel Farage and others have polarized and divided people on what is an incredibly complex topic. Edits, formatting. Edit 2. I have not answered the question about how it will benefit because, right now, no one can answer that question. Anyone who tries is misleading you. No concrete legislation has passed that allows for foresight. Everything now ranges between bad and rather bad. Check back in 10 months. Edit 3. For those interested in Luxembourg, the European Parliament has a paper about how special purpose vehicles are used for foreign direct investment. This is how companies like Amazon avoid tax. All this Brexit stuff is academic anyway if we don't fight climate change, so use Ecosia and pay to plant trees to combat climate change.